Hello, good evening. Welcome everyone to tonight's ECAMPing trip, Edmonton Identities, the history of a city in search for itself. My name is Christina Hardie and I am your host for tonight. I am the curator of the Edmonton City as Museum Facebook, or as the Edmonton City as Museum project. And yeah, a couple of pieces of housekeeping before we get started tonight. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded and hopefully live streamed to Facebook. A copy of the recording will be made available in time on the eCamp Facebook page and through YouTube. If you're joining us on the Zoom webinar, we encourage you to interact with each other using the chat at the very bottom of the page. And there's two different ways that you can use this feature. You can use it to send a message to everybody participating in the Zoom webinar this evening, or you can use it to send a message just to myself or the panelists. So if you can't hear us, or if the volume's being weird, or if there's like technical problems, you can use the chat to get a hold of us that way. And we will be taking a transcript of the Zoom chat. However, this document won't be made publicly available, but if anyone shares any helpful resources or cool links, we will share them in a post-event resource document that will be shared later next week. I also want to say hello to Elise and Joe. Elise is right there, and she is the admin assistant with the Edmonton Heritage Council, and she is going to be helping me out in part managing the back end of the webinar tonight. And we also have Joe. Joe is a communications officer with the Edmonton Heritage Council, and he will be monitoring and monitoring the Facebook live stream once that gets started. I want to encourage everyone to interact with each other using the chat and on the comment section of our Facebook live stream, but please be mindful and remember to be kind and respectful. Please note that we do have a zero tolerance policy on swearing, any personal attacks, or racist or hate-fueled speech. But we just want to make sure that everyone has a good time, and we want to make sure that's happening in a good way. We will also be having a question and answer at the very end of the session. So if you're joining us through a Zoom webinar, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can use that to submit your questions. And if you're joining us, hopefully through Facebook, you can comment on the live stream and those questions will be sent our way. Finally, before we get started tonight, I must acknowledge that the place where I am living, the place where my historical work is rooted, and the place from where I am broadcasting this event is located on Indigenous land, land that has been occupied and traveled and cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. I want to acknowledge that I'm in Treaty 6 territory, and that this place, Amiskwichiwaskagan, the Beaver Hills, Edmonton, is a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route of the Nehiwa, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot, the Métis, the Dene, and the Nakota Sioux. And I acknowledge these things not because it's politically correct or a checkbox requirement, but rather because it is a necessary reminder about the history of this place. Treaty and territorial acknowledgements are important contextual grounding points when considering the history of this place, reminding us of parts of our collective history that we are still influenced by and beholden to today. They remind us that we are occupying Indigenous lands. They remind us that Indigenous peoples have lived, traveled, and cared for this place since time immemorial. And they remind us that the history of this place did not begin with the arrival of Europeans. However, this part of our collective history, these deep-seated histories and agreements made between nations have been historically excluded from the stories we tell about the past, excluded from the stories we tell about this place, and for some, excluded from the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So For folks who have come here and whose families have come here, it is necessary not to forget our obligations as treaty people, to not forget or exclude this part of our shared history, or to position it as something that happened in the past and relevant only to the past. We must recognize the ongoing legacy and the impact of colonial violence against Indigenous peoples, and how people not Indigenous to this place have benefited and continue to benefit from that violence. And I share this, not because I have to, but because these histories and legacies are still relevant to all of us living in this place today. And these histories must be kept in mind and acknowledged and included when moving through the city and engaging with the stories of this place. Hi, hi. And with that, I would like to introduce our guest presenter for this evening. So Tom Long is a heritage programmer who specializes in living history and creative ways to engage with the public. He co-founded yegtales.ca and Northwind Heritage Consulting. He has a bachelor's degree in Canadian history from the University of Alberta and training from the National Association of Interpretation, Museum Hack, the Disney Institute, and the Alberta Museums Association. Do you want to talk about comics with him? I welcome to the screen, Tom Long. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
We're very, very happy to have you as our special guest for this ECAMPing trip. So the title of the program tonight is Edmonton's Identities, the history of a city in search for itself. So as I stop my screen sharing and you get yours started, what does identities mean to you?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I'd like to share with pictures because that's what I like to do. I'm a handsome fellow, but at the same time, nobody really wants to look at me for that long. So, see, there we go. Identities for either a city or a nation or a person, to me, are always plural. So my identities, even just the ones I want to share with you on this screen, include the fact that I'm a huge comic book nerd. And that's always been a part of my identity since I could read. But it's also a part of my identity that, you know, I had to come to terms with in the bosom of Ben Grimm, The Thing. And I like comic books. I like drawing and reading comic books. I also like writing them. So thank you for mentioning yegtales.ca, which is a project I worked on with some wonderful people, creating comics about Edmonton's history. You can also see a picture here of some cartoons that I've drawn of John Rowand and John Harriet, two of Edmonton's early fur traders. So comics and cartoons and drawing are a part of my identity, but so is my long career at Fort Edmonton Park. I worked at Fort Edmonton for almost 20 years, both in costume and without. And so that really forms another part of my nerdiness in a super triangle, because I love history and I love talking about history and finding ways to make history relevant and engaging and presenting. And that makes me think not only of my own identity, but of course, in sharing Edmonton's stories about Edmonton's identity. And then finally, another aspect of my identity is I love to travel. And I really, really enjoy going to other places and seeing how they reflect their identities. So on the right of the screen, you'll see two pictures of walk lights and stoplights in a city in a country near and dear to my heart, which is New Zealand. This is from Wellington, New Zealand. Wellington had a mayor in the 1980s, I think, who was very openly a drag queen and ran on that platform and platform heels and succeeded on it. And so as part of recognizing that heritage, Wellington changed some of its walk lights to a drag queen strutting across a street. So that's the green you can see on top. And of course, New Zealand has an indigenous population, the Maori, and the stoplight you can see on the bottom is actually a Maori doing a haka. warning you not to enter onto the street right now, or else he'll probably take you out. So that aspect of my identity in traveling, it's always interesting to see how other places identify themselves, and then I can compare that back to my home.
Awesome. Those are really, really cool stoplights. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I haven't decided who yet. I think Edmonton should put some stoplights up of, but we've got to figure out somebody.
A question for the chat.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn things over to you. And yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Great. So I'm going to go on to my next slide, and which is my theme statement about examining how Edmonton's past and present identities spring from our history and the stories we tell about ourselves and our city, and how that can help define our future. I think Edmonton can sometimes display a self-conscious embarrassment about itself, and certainly the rivalry with Calgary has its ups and downs, and I think we'll visit a few moments of that in the presentation. I think that's a pretty good way to go into this story. But I should also add that I actually developed this presentation first as a tour at Fort Edmonton, which I didn't get to give very often, and so it was a perfect opportunity to turn it into a web-based presentation. So you might see a few hints of that as I go through. One of the first identities I want to talk about that Edmonton has is as a route to the Klondike. You'll see on my timeline here, I identify that as an identity from the 60s onwards, because as much as I enjoyed Klondike days, and I know a lot of Edmontonians enjoy Klondike days, and even just looking at this picture, I can see how much fun everybody is having. Edmonton wasn't really that much of a route to the Klondike. It kind of was. It was an all-land route. But to give you an idea, in one of my travels, I went to Seattle and went to the Klondike Museum and asked excitedly about whether they had any displays about Edmonton and the all-land route. And all the docents and interpreters sort of looked at me quizzically and said, "Where? Edmonton? No, I've never heard that place." So Edmonton has a really interesting history with the Klondike gold rush in the 1890s, because while gold has always had sort of an interesting idea in Edmonton, and even now going down the river, you can see people panning for gold just as a sort of a fun thing to do on a weekend. In the late 1890s, over 1,000 people did come through Edmonton to try and make it to the Klondike by the all-land route. Almost none of them made it. A very small percentage actually made it. It's not a good route unless you're like the Hudson's Bay Company, which has a very established transportation system that can get goods and people across a vast continent in a short amount of time. You're not going to get there very easily. And so our history of the Klondike is a very brief period where a lot of merchants in Edmonton got very wealthy selling Klondike kits to intrepid explorers. And it has some great stories attached to it. It doesn't really have a whole lot to do with Edmonton's history from my perspective anyway. That being said, it is a big part of Edmonton's identity, and it's interesting to think about why. Before I move on, one really quick story about the Klondike Gold Rush that I really love. One guy whose name is sort of lost to history as far as I know, but ended up being called Beryl Smith, came to Edmonton in the late 1890s to go to the Klondike. And he had this vision for a brand new type of wagon. And this was sort of a cart or a stagecoach that sat on 3 barrels. And these barrels acted as its wheels. These are wooden barrels. So that he could store all his goods in the wheels of his cart, which were barrels, and then just sort of roll along north to the Klondike. He made it about 2 miles before those barrels burst open and spread his flour and everything else along the trail. It didn't work. It's not a good idea. Barrels aren't wheels. But this is the type of person, I think, emblematic of the type of people who thought, Edmonton to the Klondike, that's a much better way than Seattle. That's the way I'm going to go. So going back in time a little bit, why maybe Klondike Days, which was chosen in 1963 as the name for our exposition and lasted until the 2000s. Edmonton had a really tough time before the Second World War and after the First World War. And at times it was a patchwork city. And this, I think, is pretty relevant even today. Edmonton is constantly under construction. You can't go anywhere, especially in those short few months of summer, without seeing a road torn up or a crew at work tearing something down, building something up, just about everywhere in the city. Nor can you go downtown without seeing a bunch of empty lots that are being used as parking lots. Edmonton has always been a patchwork city for most of the 20th century, and a lot of the roots of that come in the 19 teens. As we're going to see in a little bit, Edmonton had a big boom before the First World War. There was a huge explosion of growth, but the teens in Edmonton really, really sucked. And it starts with the bust of the real estate market in 1912, 1913. Then we go into the First World War. In 1915, the North Saskatchewan River flooded and destroyed many communities in the river valley. In 1916, you have the Battle of the Somme. In 1917, you have Passchendaele. Every year, the casualties mount. The number of boys not coming home and women mount. And then in 1918, the influenza hits, the Spanish influenza, and kills more people than the First World War, and really hits everything super hard. 1919 hits, and all the soldiers coming back don't find the nicest place to come back to. There's labor unrest across the West, and some of that is driven by soldiers, some of it is opposed by soldiers. But soldiers often point out that they were paid $1.10 a day during the war, and men who stayed home and didn't go to war because of the shortage of labor are getting $4 a day. And you know, you can see how that would irk somebody who gave everything in the muddy fields of France. So when you come into the 1920s, sure, Edmonton booms a little bit, it roars, hems raise, and drinking and smoking and dancing become a little bit more free and easy. But Edmonton had a really tough time in the teens, and it doesn't climb its way out of the economic depression really until the 1940s. When you look at heritage buildings around Edmonton, you'll see very few of them built between 1913 and the 1940s. They do exist, but this is not a good time for Edmonton. And so as a patchwork city, you see this, the remains of this huge boom in terms of, you know, a fully developed neighborhood right next to an empty farmer's field, or a high-rise building right next to a family home from the 1890s. And you can see that in this 1919 photo here, a little bit of this patchwork identity. So going on a little bit earlier, there is some bright sides in the 1920s. Everything isn't doom and gloom. But the bright sides, besides raising hems and drinking and smoking and dancing all night, is the idea of Edmonton as the gateway to the north. And this is not a new idea, and this has been fairly persistent, but a lot of it in the 1920s pertains to aviation. Rail as well, because rail is still being built across Canada, and Edmonton is a rail hub for most of what's now northern Alberta. But the places you can't get by rail, and you can't necessarily get by car because roads aren't great either, you can get to by airplane. And if you imagine, you know, seeing for the first time in the 19-teens an airplane heavier than air travel, you can imagine how much it would capture everybody's imagination. And especially the stories of the pilots during the First World War were really like pulp fiction of the time, and you know, heroic knights and cavaliers of the air. But after the war, you know, aviation struggled a little bit to find its place. You could deliver mail, you could reach remote communities, but the things we use aviation for now, transportation is a big thing. The airplanes in the 1920s couldn't necessarily handle large groups of people. So VIPs could go on trips, politicians or businessmen inspecting businesses they had up the north that were unreachable. This is something that the pilots could do. And air shows as well. And this continued sort of the great cultural event of the pilot and aviation. So a lot of the pilots we know, Punch Dickens, Wat May, pilots always have the best nicknames, by the way. Punch Dickens, just to go back a little bit, had his nickname apparently because, not because he was awesome and his name was Punch, but because as a baby, he was really fat. And so he was called Paunch Dickens as a little kid. And so as a grown-up, that morphed into Punch Dickens, but I really like thinking of as Paunch Dickens. Imagining this little kid with his stomach poking out from under his shirt. So Wat May and Punch Dickens and Vic Horner and all these amazing bush pilots would do stunts and shows around Alberta and get everybody excited about airplanes. Wat May famously flew his plane over the baseball field in Rossdale and dropped down the baseball for the opening pitch to the mayor at the time. And there's a great story about Freddie McCall, who was a Calgary-based pilot. And I noticed we have some Calgarians in the crowd. Freddie McCall took some kids up at a fair in his biplane and then crashed it. And he crashed it right on top of a carousel. There's this amazing picture of his plane crashed on top of a midway carousel. Both the kids were fine. Freddie McCall was fine. Calgary Airport was named after him later. But, it's not the safest and it's not the most trustworthy way of transporting people or goods around Canada. But as the Klondikers had found out in the 1890s, it's not easy to get into Canada's north, and airplanes were a big step towards that. So one of the greatest stories, of course, of aviation in the 1920s is the Mercy Flight of 1929, when Wat May and Vic Horner flew diphtheria antitoxin up to the remote settlement of Little Red River in northern Alberta. Now they were flying through, this is a winter blizzard conditions. They're in the air in an open air cockpit, flying through minus 30 degrees Celsius. The coal heater they have in the airplane sometimes sets the airplane on fire in midair, and they have to put it out or land the plane to put it out. Trappers are coming out of their cabins and lighting bushfires to help them along the way. It's just an amazing story. But one of the things that makes it amazing is that everybody is hearing about it back in Edmonton, because one of the other new inventions of the teens and the 20s is the radio. And so this epic voyage of May and Horner to relieve the sickness in this remote community is just must listen broadcasting in Edmonton. And so everybody is following them all along the way up to the north when they drop off this inoculation, and then all the way they come back, so that when they come back to Edmonton, reportedly over 10,000 people show up. And that's a huge portion of Edmonton's population at the time. They show up at the field to welcome the boys home. And there's a great story. Obviously, the Aviation Museum tells great May stories, and Wat May's son, Denny May, is just, tireless in his efforts to tell the story of early aviation in Edmonton. Tony Cashman, one of my heroes, also did a great job. So I think I heard this story from Denny May, but it could have been Tony Cashman, that Wat May, when they came back to Edmonton, was invited to say a few words to this crowd of 10,000 people. And he took off his scarf, mumbled a few things, and then went off. Wat May have been sort of famously shy or reluctant to take the stage and be treated as a hero. But the story I heard was that the scarf he'd been wearing had actually frozen to his face, and when he took it off to speak, he peeled off the top layers of skin from his lips. And so I think we can forgive him for mumbling a few words into a microphone. I think I'm going to find a pot of hot coffee somewhere. So Edmonton in the early teens and late aughts. We've talked a little bit about it before, of the idea of Edmonton before the First World War as this boom town. It liked to call itself the last best west, or the Chicago of the North. These ideas evoking images. Chicago had undergone a tremendous boom in the 19th century, and now it was Edmonton's turn. So whatever you think of Edmonton defining itself by comparing it to another city, let alone an American city, this was the best idea people had for this Edmonton, which was growing up in lightning spurts before their eyes. Edmonton's population in around the turn of the century was a couple of thousand. By 1904, Edmonton and Strathcona, its sister city, combined were about 10,000. By 1913, Edmonton's population was 72,000. So that growth between 1904 and 1913 is just tremendous, the way it grew. And it leaves its mark on Edmonton today. Most of the buildings, historic buildings in Edmonton, you'll find are from the 19 teens, the very early 19 teens, 1910 to 1913, and this boom. Most of the theaters, and this is because Edmonton had been such a small settlement before that as well. Streetcar tracks and gas lines and sewage and telephone poles were easy to lay down because Edmonton was so previously undeveloped. So this idea of this Edmonton as a metropolis was very popular before the First World War. I really like Chicago of the North, but I also really like it because another American city is St. Paul, one of the twin cities with Minneapolis. A decade earlier, Edmonton was calling itself the St. Paul of the North because St. Paul in America was the sort of gateway up to Canada. So in a lot of ways, St. Paul was the gateway to the north of the United States. And Edmonton in the 1890s was still thinking of itself as the gateway to the north in terms of the access to Athabasca and the trapping of the north. And so I like the idea that Edmonton is sort of calling itself the St. Paul of the North. Wait, no, we're now the Chicago of the North. And so in the 21st century, I don't know what American city of the North we'll choose to call ourselves, but I think it's inevitable, despite what you might think. To give you an idea again of the scale of this boom, by some accounts, a lot in downtown Edmonton in Jasper was going for $1,000 to $10,000 per frontage foot, and that's in 1912 money. By some accounts, Edmonton lots are being traded as far away as India. They're being traded several times a day. And one writer said that the streets of Edmonton were constantly filled with the sound of a thwip. And that sound was a real estate salesman unveiling a map of the lots he had for sale on the street. So all you could see or hear all day was these real estate salesmen trying to sell you the lots they had available. Oh, go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, so we had a question coming in to us from Facebook, and they were wondering, just for clarification, who was calling Edmonton the Chicago of the North?
Yeah, good question. I'd have to double check. I believe that's a newspaper slogan, and Gateway to the North was also a slogan that Edmonton's businessmen came up with. The sort of business leaders trying to brand Edmonton, you might say, with a certain cachet, but I couldn't tell you for certain who exactly was saying Chicago of the North. It's something I've come across, and it's a neat idea that you can wrap up the story of this boom in. But I think the idea for me is has always stuck with me, even if I don't always remember the sources that I've heard it from.
Yeah, and so that's Edmontonians calling Edmonton the Chicago of the North, not people from outside of Edmonton.
It could be both. I'm certain that Edmontonians were calling themselves that, and again, I don't have the exact source, so take me with a grain of salt. But Edmonton also being called the Chicago of the North from outside wouldn't surprise me as well. There was a story in a New York newspaper about the close dealing of Edmonton's land sharks and how they would, how you had to be very careful about real estate agents because they would plant an accomplice in plain clothes in the crowd of people they were talking to who would just act really amazed and go, oh, wow, this guy's got amazing deals. I've been buying land all over and I've never heard of a deal this good. So while Edmontonians were calling themselves the Chicago of the North, Edmonton's boom was known far and wide, and sometimes as something that maybe people had to be a little bit careful of.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. I'll disappear again.
Great. So going back in time from the boom times to the not so booming times, Edmonton in the 1880s was a struggling settlement. I do know the exact source of the most remote settlement in the Northwest because it's what Frank Oliver, Edmonton's newspaperman who ran the Edmonton Bulletin, would refer to Edmonton in his newspaper in various contexts. Now, this often had to do with it being ignored by Ottawa Frank Oliver was a Liberal, and there was a Conservative government in power most times under Macdonald, and Frank Oliver never tired of railing against Ottawa, although it's interesting how it's flipped of a Liberal Edmontonian railing against a Conservative government in Ottawa. But Edmonton very much felt left out in the cold in a lot of ways. It was a small and struggling settlement, mainly made up of ex-Hudson's Bay Company men, sometimes from Scotland and the Orkneys. Métis, especially most women and children in Edmonton were Métis, and some new arrivals from Ontario, and even a few from the United States as well. But one of the major things that happened after the 1870s was, of course, in 1870, Canada bought the rights to Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company, and were quickly disabused by Louis Riel and the First Nations that they could just buy this land without making treaties or dealing with the people who actually lived here. But by the late 1870s, it really seemed like the West was going to be this Canadian frontier, much like the Americans had developed. And so the railway was set to come through the settlements along the North Saskatchewan River, and what's was once the Carleton Trail, an old cart trail. So Edmonton was convinced it was going to have this railway that would come through Edmonton from Winnipeg and bring all the settlers you needed to turn this dusty prairie town or settlement into a boom town. When in 1882, the CPR changed its mind and decided to go through a more southerly route instead, and in fact ended up going through Calgary, which Edmonton was not pleased about, and I don't think has ever completely forgiven them, even if it's forgot the original region why it hated Calgary. So Calgary stole our railway, and Edmonton was in trouble. In 1882, 1883, there were a couple of hundred people in Edmonton, and most of especially the Ontarians and the Euro-Canadian Edmontonians thought of the railway as their ticket to success. And without one, Edmonton was in a danger of sort of drying up and maybe not succeeding as a settlement. Luckily, Edmonton was full of extremely stubborn people. And a good example of this is when the land office decided that it would move south to Strathcona, or South Edmonton as it was known at the time. Edmontonians showed up to the land office on the north side and took the wheels off the wagon that they were loading all the land office stuff into it, and then set up a camp around the land office. And the land agent sent for the Northwest Mounted Police, who weren't really interested in interfering with a mob of armed Edmontonians. And so a couple of quick telegrams to Ottawa, and it got settled. But this is far from the only time that Edmontonians took vigilante action to protect their own interests. And so the stubbornness of Edmonton eventually would win out over its remoteness and what it saw as the lack of interest showed in it by Ottawa when a spur line came up from the railway in 1891 and began a slow climb up to that boom time that we know about. So going back a little bit earlier and a little bit of a jump in time here, before Canada even became involved in the West, Edmonton was a trading post in the early 1800s. Fort Edmonton, or Edmonton House, was always its official name, but it had other names too, and one of them was the Fort de Prairie. But it wasn't the only Fort de Prairie, and so sometimes you heard of the Forts de Prairies, and this often referred to Fort Carleton and Fort Pitt, two other Hudson's Bay Company trading posts along the North Saskatchewan River. And this idea of the fort on the prairies is really interesting to me because, again, it has to do with Edmonton's sense of geographic place. Edmonton is in a really interesting geographic location in Alberta, especially in the sense that it's in the middle of the sort of scrubby aspen parkland, and it has access to the parkland and the boreal forest to the north, which is where the best beaver can be found and the best fur-bearing animals, to put it simply. But then the prairies and the plains to the south are also within Edmonton's scope of gathering resources. So either gathered by their First Nations trading partners, or sometimes by Hudson's Bay Company men themselves, Fort Edmonton, Fort Carleton, and Fort Pitt had access to bison from the plains. And these countless herds of bison that were the lifeblood of the nations who lived there, and the tolerated guests who lived in the forts along the North Saskatchewan. So, you know, one of the amazing things about the fur trade and amazing statistics that anybody who's ever worked in a fur trade fort as an interpreter would be able to tell you is that Hudson's Bay Company men were worked so hard by the company, they were fed up to 9 pounds of meat a day. Less if it was pemmican, because that was so nutritious and rich, but fresh meat, 9 pounds a day. This is an amazing amount of food, but it shows you how hard they're working in cold weather to lift furs and do what the clerks tell them around town. So if the men of the Hudson's Bay Company are getting fed this much, where does the food come from? It comes from Edmonton and Fort Pitt and Fort Carleton, who are trading in just as many bison products by the 1840s as they are beaver products. Edmonton is a pemmican making center. They're trading for pemmican, but they're also trading for meat and turning it into pemmican, and then sending it north to trading posts in fur-rich countries who can't necessarily feed themselves. As the First Nations could tell you, and probably did tell them, staying in one place in the prairies during the early 19th century is not a good way to stay alive. It's very hard to live when you're not following you know, your seasonal rounds to go and harvest the resources you need to live. But the fur trading companies need to stay in one place. And so sending out hunting parties and trading for buffalo was one of the ways the entire Hudson's Bay Company trading network stayed alive. And that was because Edmonton was a fort of the prairie and had access to that biosphere and its resources through their trading partners. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I think it is really important, obviously, to mention that Edmonton's Cree name was, as Christina mentioned earlier, Amiskwaciy-Waskaikan, and the Amiskwaciy part of that is the Beaver Hills. And so Edmonton's identity for thousands upon thousands of years is not as Edmonton, but as part of the Beaver Hills. In terms of scope, and I do want to get this across, I'm only talking about this briefly, but again, as an interpreter's useful tool, if you just look at the number of trees in this photo entirely, and if each of those trees stood for 500 years, then Edmonton was a Euro-Canadian inhabited place for a half to a quarter of one of those trees, and for the rest of those trees, Edmonton is inhabited by Indigenous people, and it has been since time immemorial. Edmonton was inhabited by people before the Roman Empire was established. Edmonton was inhabited by people before the pyramids were built. Edmonton has been inhabited by people since time out of memory or time immemorial. It's a ridiculous expanse of time that we don't always talk about. And I'm not going to talk about it because I'm not an Indigenous person. And we've had a lot of stories of Indigenous stories told by non-Indigenous people up till now. And I think one of the great things ECAMP and the Edmonton Heritage Council and the City of Edmonton is doing these days is empowering and enabling Indigenous people to tell their own stories. And so that's why I'm going to move on to the next phase of the talk, which is a guessing game. So I'd like you to make sure that your chat screens are open because I'm going to show you a few slides and tell you a few stories and see if you can guess the identity of Edmonton that I'm trying to connect this story to. Sometimes it's not a one-for-one, a very obvious connection, but I love stories. I think Edmonton has the best stories out there. And I think that you're going to find some fun times connecting them to the identities that I've chosen. Christina, are we ready to go?
We sure are.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to move back forward in time a little bit and think about Edmonton as a trading post on the North Saskatchewan. The trading link in a network that spans the continent and 3 or 4 different drainage basins. Think about the North Saskatchewan River, it empties into the Hudson's Bay. But from Edmonton, a short distance overland is Fort Assiniboine or Athabasca Landing on the Athabasca River, which empties into the Arctic Basin. And if you go up the Athabasca River, upstream instead of downstream, you get to Jasper House. From Jasper House, you can go over the Height of Lands and get onto a whole new set of river systems that connect to the Pacific Drainage Basin. So if you imagine North America during the 19th century, the Hudson's Bay Company is a continent-spanning company that needs to get trading goods from water to almost anywhere in the continent. And Edmonton is a link. In fact, if you think about Edmonton collecting the beaver furs or other staple furs and loading it onto York boats, sending it down the river to Norway House, and then upstream on the Hazer-Nelson River to York Factory, where those furs get onto a tall ship and then sail across the Atlantic Ocean and then up the Thames River to the city of London, where they're put on market. Edmonton and London are connected by water. And that's how before planes or trains or automobiles, you can have this world economy connected to North America. And there's one of my favorite Edmonton identities very connected to this story of Edmonton sitting on the watery highway of the West. So maybe in the chat, you guys can guess which identity I'm referring to.
No guesses quite yet.
Be brave. There's no wrong answers. You can get it. This is a Edmonton identity that I love, and especially at this time of year when we have this gorgeous valley full of fall colors that is Edmonton's shining jewel today and in the past.
All right, so we have some guesses coming in. Someone says Fort de Prairie, and now we have River City.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, so that is it.
That's the one I'm thinking of, and I believe we have a special presentation on the River City.
And let me know how the volume is.
Hello, ECAMPers. My name is Neil Kramer. I'm a historian here in the city of Edmonton, and I'm on the North Saskatchewan River today to share with you some really interesting things. Now, there's all sorts of cool stuff you can see in the valley here. One of the neatest is sediment layers that you can spot. And so this acts like a geological timeline for us. And in it, you can see different layers of like coal, and occasionally you can see like a bright white layer of ash, and that's volcanic ash from an eruption that happened thousands of years ago. So that's really cool to see. Now, the river has always been super important to the city of Edmonton, even long before we called this place Edmonton. First Nation groups traveled all around what would be Western Canada, and they would have to cross rivers. And the Edmonton area was a very prominent crossing location. So up ahead of us here, past the high-level bridge, we have the Walterdale and Rossdale Flats. And this was a very prominent crossing location. It's where a lot of groups would meet as well. They would trade, and then they'd go about their business, and then they would come back again, meet with other groups, and establish new trade networks. This happened all across the North Saskatchewan River, but this was just a very prominent spot. So important was it that eventually, when Europeans started coming out here, this is where they built their fur trading forts. So Fort Edmonton had several iterations, and they were all located along the north bank of the river valley, right in this area here. The prominence continued even once settlement started to occur, and you had people actually building permanent structures out here. Access to the river valley was vital to the development of Edmonton. It gave them access to natural resources. So we talked about the coal, there was lumber, clay, anything you could think of, as well as transportation routes. Of course, it helped connect Edmonton. So prominent was all of this that when Edmonton was finally named the capital of the province and the decision was being made for where to put the legislature, it was decided that or at least one of the reasons to put it in this location was because of the significance that the river had to the development of Edmonton. So that does it for this little ECAMPing update. Enjoy the rest of your ECAMPing trip. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my float on the river.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neil, for joining us. Hope you have a good float down the river. All right, what's next, Tom? Oh, I see.
There we go. Fantastic. So thanks. So I hope the crowd is getting used to the idea of this game, and thanks to Neil. So the next one I have is a dusty prairie settlement that is remote, but is in danger of drying up. This is a name that Edmontonians use today, sometimes in jest, sometimes in seriousness, but I think you can connect it back to this time in Edmonton when the railway has been stolen by Calgary, and the homesteads that have been established by the survey are up for grabs for, as often said, $10 plus your hard work. But I think in 1886, like one person showed up for a homestead. This is not an easy time for Edmonton. There's very little cash in the settlement. Most people are bartering things. Everybody has to grow enough food to feed themselves because there's not a thriving economy at this point. So it's a city in the doldrums where nothing is happening and there's nothing to do. And I think that's something you might be familiar with from later decades. So see if you can guess the name that we haven't mentioned yet that I'm thinking of for this story of Edmonton's many bust periods.
All right, we have some folks chiming in the chat, and they all have it right away. It is Deadmonton.
Great, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. It's a name that I think Edmontonians use with a little bit of pride now, especially if they love Halloween. But it does evoke a story that I'm really excited for Lance to tell us about.
Hey there, ECAMPers, it's Lance Cardinal here. Now for this City as Museum moment, I've been asked to look for the old Canadian Pacific Railway depot here in Old Strathcona. And you know what? I think I found it. Check it out. Here it is right here, the most amazing, beautiful historical building that is in Old Strathcona. So let's find out more about it and go check it out. Now I am here right now on the very railroad tracks where the first train arrived here in Strathcona in Edmonton on about November 25th, 1891. It was only like 129 years ago, but man, oh man, can you imagine pulling up to the station and seeing this incredible structure and being very excited about what amazing things you're gonna see here in Edmonton. So, so cool. The Strathcona Station here in Edmonton was the northernmost terminus station for the Calgary and Edmonton line, and for a lot of years was known as the end of steel. Pretty cool. Now, did you know that a lot of Edmonton's rail history is still visible here in Edmonton and Strathcona? For example, this building here that we just talked about, it is now an amazing restaurant serving all the guests around the local area. So let's check out some more things here in Strathcona that remind us of the old railway. Now, the old Strathcona Hotel was built in 1891, the same year the first train arrived here in Edmonton, and was the biggest hotel here until 1904. Now, a lot of immigrants who first arrived here in Edmonton used the hotel as their home, so it's a very important part of Edmonton history. Now, we certainly can't talk about rail history here in Strathcona without at least mentioning the Edmonton high-level streetcar, which operates out of Strathcona in the summer, spring, and fall. Such an amazing experience for tourists to check out. Now, this streetcar started in 1908, and it had a total of 19 kilometers when it first opened. Now, it's open as a tourist attraction here in Edmonton, and something you don't want to miss out on. Well, ECAMPers, that does it for me for this amazing moment here in Old Strathcona, learning about the rail history. And look, I'm here at this beautiful old CP rail caboose to say goodbye at the end of the steel line. And once again, thank you so much. I'm Lance Cardinal. Check me out on Facebook or Instagram. And yeah, have a great day. See you later, ECAMPers.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lance, to talk about Deadmonton.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a great point. I think somebody pointed out in the chat that there are some funny dates there in terms of the building itself and which building we're talking about. But there's no better place to find rail history than in Strathcona, which, and as probably a lot of our e-campers know, and Catherine may have pointed out there, the rail line didn't necessarily come to Edmonton so much as it came to South Edmonton, which became Strathcona. And that was a whole other fight to get an actual rail link to Edmonton itself. In fact, back in the 1870s, when the Northwest Mounted Police first came out, one of the reasons they established Fort Saskatchewan instead of staying in Edmonton, which they hated for various reasons. But the Mounties were thought that nobody could ever bridge the height of land at Edmonton with a railway. And so they thought if a rail did come north, it would actually come through at Fort Saskatchewan instead, because it was much easier to build a bridge. So whenever you see the high level bridge or run across it, you can think, ha, take that, Mounties.
And I'll also add, Catherine in the chat said that the original depot, there's a replica of it on 105th Street and 84th Avenue. And the building that MKT is in, if I'm recalling correctly, was built in 1907. So that's not exactly what it would have looked like as you rolled up, but a few years later, when more and more folks were starting to come to Edmonton, we needed a bigger train depot.
So Edmonton, after the railway finally arrives, starts to grow, and settlement increases in the west. You start to see new and different immigrants in the 1890s as immigration laws relax, and chain migration starts to happen as well. You see new Jewish immigrants, Arab immigrants, the Chinese are already here having built the railway. But the Liberals start to really look at, in the federal government, start to look at the famous stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats. So then they, along with other settlers, start to grow in the West, to the point where the territories of the West, the Northwest Territories, start to and have honestly for decades advocated for a full provincial status and the right to self-government. And there's a really interesting time around here when you start to think about what the West could look like. And Christina and I were talking about some of the plans for, in the news these days is the one big province of Buffalo. But there are also plans for the those prairies from Fort de Prairie and then the parkland to be separated into two different provinces. So rather than the vertical provinces that we eventually got, the idea of horizontal provinces is always interesting to me, especially since if sort of imagine that the southern prairies would incorporate both Regina and Calgary. And since Regina was already the capital of the Northwest Territories, Calgary still wouldn't be the capital of its new province. And so this sort of discussion comes to an interesting head in the early 20th century when the government has to go somewhere, and Edmonton is interested in it going there. So this is a name that I think won't take you guys too long to get.
Yeah, what Edmonton identity is Tom giving us hints towards? Let's hear your responses in the chat. Yep, lots of responses coming in for capital city.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorites. I think we've got a video to queue up.
We sure do. All right.
Hello, Tom and Christina, and all of you e-campers. So nice to see everyone today. My name is Tim Marriott, and I'm with Alberta History Tours. If you looked up what the definition of a capital city is, it would tell you that it's a principal city of a region which brings together commerce, transportation, activity, history, and above all, community. Well, where we're standing right now, this hill, actually a series of terraces down to the river, has been a site of community and that kind of activity for millennia. Indigenous people in what's now Alberta were meeting here, carrying on trade here, hundreds, thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. When the Europeans did arrive in the late 18th century, they simply came to the spot where the indigenous people had been carrying on these activities for years. And so where we're standing is probably one of the 2 or 3 most recognizable sites in all of Alberta, and it says Edmonton. And it says Edmonton in capital letters. So this quiet spot is the actual site of the last Fort Edmonton, and these peaceful surroundings belie the fact that this was once a beehive of activity, where trade was carried out, where commerce occurred, where boats were built, where family matters were lived out, and where a community was built. And all of those things happened also when the indigenous people were here many, many years, thousands of years before the Europeans came. So when the province of Alberta was established, literally just a few hundred yards from here, this seems a natural spot to establish the capital of the new province. Despite other cities vying to be the capital, such as Vegreville, Banff, Athabasca, and unbelievably Calgary, Edmonton was chosen as the permanent capital. Now, that requires certain buildings to be built for the capital status, such as the courthouse, government house, and this beautiful legislative building that we're standing in front of now. Come down for a tour, and the Alberta Legislative Assembly historical interpreters will take you on a fascinating tour. But let's leave with just one little small story to finish our evening. We're at the official cornerstone of the Alberta Legislative Building, dedicated at a ceremony presided over by the Governor-General in 1909. Cornerstones are usually filled with things like coins, newspapers, etc. of the day. Well, 2 vaudevillians, who on the vaudeville circuit had decided to take a temporary job working on the building of this legislative building, decided that they should have a cornerstone of their own. So after the official ceremony, they dedicated their own stone, and one wonders what they might have put inside their unofficial stone. So next time you're here, take a look around at all of these stones and try to guess which was the vaudevillian cornerstone.
Thanks for that, Tim. All right, what's up next?
So I do think it's interesting to note that we had talked about Klondike Days before, which after it dropped the Klondike Days name tried to rebrand itself as Capital X, an identity that was roundly mocked and dismissed and didn't find a lot of traction with Edmontonians who lived in the capital city. But I do have a quick tidbit to add. This is one of my favorite stories and photographs to Capital City. This is a window display from McDougall and Secord, and it's got a number of different dolls. It's hard to make them out, but the doll on the one side of the screen is labeled Edmonton, but the grown-up mannequin is labeled Mother Canada. And they're all reaching for a dollhouse that is labeled the capital. And there's a little speech bubble that comes off the little doll that is Calgary, half the size of Edmonton. And the speech bubble says, "Ma, Ma, I want it." And Mother Canada has a speech bubble there. You can see the sort of weird shape there. And she's saying, "Don't be naughty, Calgary. Let your older sister have it. Go and run and play with your railway." So I love that Edmontonians, even in 1905, didn't lose a chance to make a quick poke at our sisters to the south. So I'm going to move on a little bit, although we're still in generally the same era. And this is an era when the growth of the middle class and wealth allowed women especially to take up certain causes. Particularly temperance was one, the banning of alcohol and demon rum. But the other was women's suffrage. And so they were able to take this cause. The West particularly, and Edmonton in specific, was home to a number of different suffrage associations who marched, wrote letters, made mocking plays, and otherwise advocated for this amazing cause. And so the story of the early suffragists and then later the fight for the persons case is one that I think a lot of Edmontonians know and can see around town. But I think it's an interesting chance to attach this story to another name that Edmonton chose in the 1980s that identifies the volunteer spirit, not only of suffragists, but others who in the 80s would help a community recover from a devastating tornado, who today volunteer in the arts and fight for causes, especially ones that don't have a very loud voice of their own. So this is a name that isn't often applied to this story, but I think you'll agree resonates fairly strongly. Oh, I can't hear you.
Some people rolling in the chat, and they say it loud and they say it clear. Edmonton is the city of champions.
Yeah, fantastic.
Hi, ECAMPers! My name is Benita Hartwell, and I am one of the curators of the City of Edmonton Heritage Collection, housed here in the City of Edmonton Artifact Center in the old O'Keefe Brewery down here in the River Valley. And for this City as Museum moment, I wanted to share with you an artifact from our collection, which is Emily Murphy's Magistrates chair. This was the chair that she used while she served as the first British female magistrate in the British Empire from 1916 to 1931, and it was in the newly founded Edmonton Women's Court. Emily Murphy was a member of the well-known Famous Five, and it is through this that she is commemorated in one of our City of Edmonton parks, along with the 4 other women. And in part, they're commemorated for their work in the Persons case, which was a direct result of Emily Murphy's work as magistrate, but also through their work in acquiring the vote for some women, though not all women. We'll note that Indigenous women didn't receive the vote until 1960. And when reflecting on something like Emily Murphy's chair, we also have to look at the legacy that she represents, as she was a very vocal advocate of the eugenics movement and very influential in the passing of the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta in 1928, which was not repealed until 1972, and after over 2,800 people in Alberta were sterilized against their will. This is part of the legacy of Emily Murphy. So when we commemorate that, we have to remember that as well. And I want you to think about in this chair notions of power, notions of absence. Who doesn't have a seat at a table, and who isn't being represented in stories, in our commemorations of place name, in artifacts, in landmarks, and so forth. And I want you to think about in Emily Murphy's chair also the absences that are there. That this chair can tell the story of also the women and girls who had to stand before Emily Murphy, the magistrate, and be judged by her. But we generally don't commemorate their stories. And why don't we do that? So, ECAMPers, I hope you have a great trip, and signing out for now from here. Bye!
Bye, Benita. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think it's important to remember that in our search for identities and our travel through identities, that stories change depending on who tells them. And sometimes the same story can have different aspects depending on who's telling them and who is centered in that story, both the power and the challenge of stories. So speaking of which, the next name I want people to guess is, again, a little bit more obscure, especially than City of Champions. And this has to do with Edmonton's diversity, and especially one of the ones most celebrated, the first Ukrainian immigrants in Edmonton. So immigration, I'm not going to tell the story as well as a video you're going to have a little bit later. But Edmonton has seen immigration and migration of peoples since time immemorial. In the 1880s, as I said, you had Scottish and French Canadian, Métis, a few Americans, First Nations people in this area. By the 1890s and the early 20th century, you have Ukrainians and Poles and South Asians and Chinese and Jewish people and Arab people, and what starts to become our multicultural fabric. Now, this is a name that Edmonton uses sort of tongue-in-cheek and sometimes with a sly wink, but I've generally heard it said by Ukrainians. And so if there's any Ukrainians out there in the crowd, they might get what name I'm going for right now pretty quick.
And I think the eCampers are starting to get a hang of it, because we had answers in the chat before you even finished. So the resounding cry is that it is Edmund Chuck.
Yeah, fantastic.
Hello, Dobry den. I'm Kevin Barron from the Ukrainian Pioneers Association of Alberta. eCampers, for this City as Museum moment, I'm going to tell you about Ukrainian place names in Edmonton. Our first place name is Pilapau Industrial. It's named after the first family of Ukrainians to come to Alberta, Ivan and Maria Polypiu, as they said back then. Now, the Polypiu family and 10 other families from their village were the only Ukrainians in Alberta for the first few years. They were farming northeast of Edmonton when a professor from the university in the Old Country came out and visited them. He wrote an influential book about his visit, recommending that all poor peasants in the area should move to Canada. And starting in 1896, thousands and thousands of people started arriving in Western Canada. Now, the Ilescu neighborhood in Edmonton is named after that influential professor. Now, the sons and daughters of those pioneers got educated, a lot of them, started businesses, and some moved to Edmonton. One of those businessmen was William Horlock. Not only was he a businessman, he was elected mayor of Edmonton on 3 separate occasions. Now, Horlock was mayor of Edmonton when the park that we're in right now was named Mayfield Park in 1967 and developed to what we see today. After his death, it was renamed William Horlock Park in his honor, and now it's where everyone goes for the Heritage Days Festival, which was also started when Horlock was the mayor. Well, eCampers, I want to say thank you, Diakoyu. I've been Kevin from the Ukrainian Pioneers Association of Alberta. Look for our new website, which will be launching soon. And see you later. Do pobачення.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, fantastic. And I love how that so easily connects to Horlock Park and then the Heritage Festival, because those celebrations are such another evidence of Edmonton's identity. And Heritage Festival obviously being a favorite of Edmontonians, celebrating the diverse multicultural nature of our city in one of the best ways possible with different types of food on sticks. Of course, there are also amazing dances and performances and souvenirs, but man, that food, so good. So speaking of which, Edmonton has another identity that is going to bring us back to the exhibition, which later was renamed Klondike Days, but existed since the early days of the settlement of Edmonton. And well, we do have a very long and very cold winter in Edmonton, which makes for very thick beaver pelts. It is a relief whenever the spring thaw comes, and Edmontonians cram in as many celebrations as they can into those couple of months that they've got. And growing, especially in the last couple of years, I think, putting a few more celebrations in those winter months as well. So this is one of my favorite identities, and I don't think it's going to take these eCampers long to come up with this one.
Oh, it sure didn't.
Yeah.
It sure didn't. We have lots of messages rolling into the panelists that says, Festival City.
Hey there, eCampers, it's Lance Cardinal here. Now for this City as Museum moment, I'm going to be exploring the fringe grounds here in Old Strathcona and talk about the amazing festivals we have here in Edmonton. as some of you may or may not know, Edmonton hosts over 50 festivals every year, which is an amazing thing, and that is why we are known as Festival City. Now, people come from all over the world to experience these festivals, and we have things like the Theatre Festival, which is called the Fringe Festival, the Works Festival, which is the Arts Festival, the Street Performers Festival, the Taste of Edmonton Food Eating Festival, and I mean, it's one of those amazing things that happens every year and brings the whole city together. Now, normally Strathcona is filled with people all summer long with different festivals going on, specifically the Fringe Festival that happens here every year. But as some of you may know, and of course I'm sure a lot of you know, COVID has set in and things are going to be a little bit different here for the festival time. But as always, we are resilient here in Alberta, and the festival will go on and in lots of different ways. So there'll be food eating festivals, there'll be clown making festivals, there'll be street performers, and there'll be everything Edmonton expects here in Edmonton at the Festival City. So that's it for me, Lance Cardinal, here for Festival City Update. See you guys later. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again, Lance. I know that I was missing my summer festivals really, really bad this year.
Yeah. One of my favorite memories from working at Fort Edmonton in my early days as an interpreter was the weekends when almost none of the supervisors would be there. There'd be one person who sort of was the sacrificial lamb to supervise for that weekend because everybody else was on the hill at Gallagher for Folk Fest. And it was just something that people can't miss. And I love that about this city, and everybody's got a favorite festival. But the Fringe and Folk Fest really do take the cake in a lot of ways. Lance also just puts us to shame with the quality of his videos, right? He's so good. I love it.
Yeah, he's a pro.
So coming up more close to the modern day, one of my favorite pieces of Edmonton area architecture, although not actually in Edmonton, comes an identity that brings us back to aviation in an interesting way. And a very modern way. I love talking about the intersections of early aviation and early radio. I think this is the intersection of aviation and an entirely different technology that has taken this city by storm. I mentioned before how much I love that in the last 20 years, the Amiskwaciwa Skycan has become much more commonly known and much more commonly used. I'm not sure if it beats this identity of Edmonton for widespread use.
All right, folks, let's get your guesses. What Edmonton identity is Tom alluding to? So someone says Gateway to the North. A couple of people say Gateway to the North.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good one. It's not the one I'm thinking of, but that doesn't mean you're wrong. I'm thinking of one that's much shorter and pithy. Yeah. Maybe
someone
there
does
you
say,
go.
Oh, sorry. Top of the World.
Oh, that's a good one.
A good one. All right, we've had a couple of folks submit. It is YAG.
Great, yeah.
Hello, ECAMPers. This is Nicholas Mather from the Alberta Aviation Museum. For this City as Museum moment, many Edmontonians are familiar with the initials YEG, from seeing it on their baggage tags at the airport. This is the International Air Transport Association code, or IATA, for the City of Edmonton International Airport. But did you know that this was not always the case? Our museum is stationed in Blatchford Field, the site of Edmonton's municipal airport. Built in 1927 and established as Canada's first licensed airport in 1929, it was named for former Edmonton Mayor Kenneth Blatchford. Edmonton's teletype weather station at Blatchford Field was assigned the code XD, which pilots used this code to refer to the airport. When the IATA assigned official 3-digit codes for all Canadian airports, they designated Y to identify all airports in Canada. And Edmonton's airport became YXD. This remained our staple IATA code until the establishment of the Edmonton International Airport in 1960. In the 60s, there was a desire to brand the codes closer to the cities that were attached to them, much like Vancouver's YVR and Winnipeg's YWG. However, the code YED was already taken by the military base at Namao. So instead they looked at EG, which is the official railway code for the city of Edmonton. This seemed like a fitting choice, given that both air travel and railways were very crucial in developing the city as we know it today. You could say that YEG is airplane speak for Gateway to the North. You can thank the Twitterverse and MacMail for bringing this code into the mainstream in 2008. The Edmonton journalist noticed that a few Calgarians were using YYC to connect, assemble, and organize. By his suggestion to use YEG, it has now become one of the most used hashtags in Canada. IATA code hashtags. You could say it was an Alberta invention. We hope you enjoyed this little insight into Edmonton's rich aviation history. If you would like to know more information, feel free to subscribe to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can visit our towering planes in person by purchasing your advanced boarding passes online on our website.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks to the Aviation Museum.
Oh, sorry. What were you saying? I was just drinking my YXD beer from the Growlery Microbrew, very close to the Aviation Museum in Blatchford.
Very neat.
Oh, that's smooth. So beer is one of those things that I also think you occasionally find identities reflected in, YXD being one of them. But now I would like to put a poll up about somewhere else where we see Edmonton's identities popping up. So I've taken out obviously the two biggest sports teams in Edmonton, and instead we have a number of the other names here from over the years. And I'm wondering, and maybe it's changed since this presentation, or maybe you just have a favorite anyway, if you have one that resonates the most with you. The Riverhawks is the newest, I believe. It's one of the new baseball teams.
Oh, still got some more votes coming in. Awesome.
Okay. Chimos is another interesting one. I was telling Christina about this. When I first read it, I was like, oh, Ukrainian, Edmonchuk. Because when I hear Chimo, I think of Chimo pierogies. So it took me a couple of seconds to realize that they were spelling Chimo differently. And then I had to look it up to find out what the heck is a Chimo anyway. And according to the web anyway, it's a anglicization of an Inuit greeting that was popular in Canada in the 1960s and a little bit later in Ontario and some other parts. So maybe some of our e-campers are more familiar with Chimo than I was. I just thought pierogi.
We do have some questions popping up in the chat.
Oh, great.
So someone wants to know if all of these team names are real. So the Oil Kings, Capitals, Ice, Trappers, Prospects, Aviators, Roadrunners, Riverhawks, Stingers, and Chimos. So are they real?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm okay at drawing cartoons of John Rowan. I'm not good at making logos for sports teams up. So I found these all on the web and the histories of Edmonton's different sports teams. Of course, I didn't put the grads in here. I hope people will forgive me for that. But grads didn't seem to resonate with the identities we talked about quite as much. Oh, that's interesting too. I don't know about the rest of you. My parents came to Edmonton for the university. They both came from elsewhere in Alberta, went to school here, and then decided to stay here. So, you know, my list of identities isn't comprehensive, certainly, because I didn't even mention universities or graduates. Edmonton has a startling number of universities in it and has for a very long time.
We have an interesting comment in the chat here. So Vanessa says that Chimo pierogies used to have an Inuit caricature as their logo.
Really?
So there is a connection there.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And it looks like it is the Trappers. that resonate the most? Yeah. And someone mentions that Cracker Cats was interesting as well.
Yeah, I was talking about this with my brothers last night, they, I was talking about, absolutely, I love the Oilers, and Drillers is a great name for a soccer team. Oil Kings and Energy, I start to get a little bit like, okay, we've got it. And then Cracker Cats is also an oil field reference. I believe it's a part of a pipeline. So Cracker Cats is a great name for a sports team, especially for a baseball team. But it is, again, doubling down on that energy history, which is another completely valid identity of Edmonton that I love. But it is somewhat overrepresented in our sports teams, I think.
All right. Well, folks, we have come to kind of the end of the presentation. Here, I think I may have jumped a little bit, Tom, so I'll pass it back over to you.
No, it's okay. I think you're exactly, I was going to say the exact same thing. I like this as a wrap-up page because it sort of encapsulates some of the identities we've looked at. I don't think any city, just like any person, has to just pick one identity. I think these all encapsulate different parts of us, and many of them encompass different stories even within themselves. City of Champions is a good one I'm thinking of. Again, it's not a comprehensive list. I haven't talked about energy or the universities, although those don't have easy, nice, like university town ones to encapsulate here. But I think it's interesting to attach these stories, attach these identities to stories, but then I also really loved the opportunity to share with some of these amazing presenters the opportunity to connect these stories to buildings or structures, or pieces of public art, or things that you guys are going to see all through your lives in Edmonton. And I hope you'll spare a moment when you see the high level or the capital or the river to think a little bit about your city's identity. Because I think that by looking at those and understanding these stories and telling them and sort of marinating in them, we can help define our future.
Well said. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Well, folks, we do have time for questions from the audience. I've been receiving some through Facebook, so I'm going to turn to those momentarily. But someone wants to remind us that another thing that Edmonton can be called is Purple City.
Oh, I only have heard that one.
What? You haven't heard of Purple City?
No, I've heard Brown Town, but I like that there's more than one colors I can use here. That's fantastic.
Well, there is an Edmonton City as Museum Project article about Purple City, so I'll be sure to put that in the post-event resource doc.
I'm going to look it up.
But Purple City is something that the youth would go do. You would go to the legislature building, and all around the outside of the building, they have those big orange pod lights that light up the structure.
Yeah.
So as a teenager, you would go and stare into those lights for a period of time. And then when you look out at the city, since your eyes were just flushed with orange light, the city looks purple.
That's amazing.
Wow.
I was probably at home reading a comic about The Thing, so I wasn't hanging out with cool people looking into lights, but now I'm definitely going to try that.
Yeah, we can go stare at lights together sometime, Tom.
Cool.
And someone else, color themed, says that Redmonton related to politics.
Yeah, I love that one.
To the Liberals, yeah.
Oh, Purple City, Brown Town, and Redmonton, we're getting another whole presentation here I can put together for next year.
Yeah. All right, so if you have a question for Tom or myself, please put it in the chat or use the Q&A feature. I'm also really interested thinking about Edmundchuk and kind of a name connected to a cultural group. I've been trying to think if there's other names for Edmonton that come from communities that I'm not a part of. So maybe there are names happening that we don't really know.
Absolutely.
All right, so while we wait for some things, I am going to, where is that question coming for me? So this might be a bit more of like an aviation specific question, so we might not be able to answer it live, but perhaps someone in the chat can answer it. But they were looking for some clarification around ham radios. So this is when we were talking about Gateway to the North. Does anyone know if the ham radio was used before community radio stations like CKUA came out? So I guess, because I don't really know much about ham radios either, but if that was being more so used just for communication, or if that was something that you could like listen in to something going on.
Only Edmonton had a radio museum. We could get to make a video about that.
All right. So it doesn't look, I don't have any questions in the chat, and we don't have Q&A questions. So this might be like the first ECAMPing trip where we don't like just keep pushing that goodbye time limit, but we have time for questions.
That's totally fine. I was a guest at both your ECAMPing trips with Matt Hilterman, which I really, really enjoyed. And that was one where just like, I had a million questions and so did everybody else, and it was great. But that was a different, you know, style of thing. And I think a lot of these stories have to do with things that Edmontonians know or resonate already with themselves. So I hope that in lieu of questions for me, because I'm certainly not an expert on Edmonton, I'm just an Edmontonian who likes to think about things, that there's going to be self-reflection and conversations maybe at home more than questions for me. Other than where did I get this fabulous barley wine? Because it's so good.
So I did get a chat message. Yeah. I did get a chat message from our special guest, Nick, from the Aviation Museum, and he thinks that he's going to have to ask the curator about this ham radio question, but I'll reach out to the Aviation Museum and I will aim to provide a follow-up answer to that. Yeah. All right, well, I think if that's it, we can kind of start calling that our night. So first off, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us as our special guest for tonight's ECAMPing trip. You're always a pleasure to learn from, and you're so well-spoken, and I'm just really appreciative of everything that you've shared with us tonight. So thank you so much.
It was very kind to say. Thank you very much. I enjoyed very much the chance to talk about it and opine and think, and then work with all these amazing people who contributed videos. This is the third time I think I've worked with eCamp, and every time has been a treat. So if all of you aren't following eCamp, you definitely should. They do amazing work, and I'm loving the series of articles that are coming out the last couple of weeks and years and months.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tom. We definitely have to do a really, really big thank you to all of the City as Museum Moment video creators who kind of agreed to this, this idea that we had. So thank you so much to Neil Kramer, Lance Cardinal, Tim Marriott, Benita Hartwell, Kevin Barron, and Nick Mather from the Alberta Aviation Museum. Thank you so much for all of the work that you did putting together this ECAMPing trip. And since Tom referenced it, I am going to do a big push for all of the different things that the Edmonton City as Museum project does. So to stay on top of what those things are, I encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and to check out the Edmonton City as Museum project website. So on the website, in addition to having information about all of our upcoming events, we have a big story collection. So stories about Edmonton's histories written from the perspectives of Edmontonians. So these are 3 of the stories that are kind of some of the newest additions to our collection. And in the last 2 weeks, we've released part 1 and part 2 of the history of gay bars in Edmonton, with 3 more parts coming out. And we release new stories, new content written by Edmontonians every single Wednesday. So be sure to stay in touch and learn more about the city that surrounds you through eCamp. Oh, I've lost my mouse, that's all. All right. I also have to say a really, really big thank you to the folks who are helping me today. So I want to say thank you to Elise, who's the admin assistant here at the Edmonton Heritage Council. Thank you so much for your help on the back end of these Zoom webinars. I really couldn't do it without you. And I want to say a really big thank you to Joe, the communications officer with the Edmonton Heritage Council, who has been monitoring our Facebook Live feed and sending me questions and comments. I really appreciate your participation as well. I did notice that we just had a question pop up in the Q&A, so I'm tempted. I just want to take a look at it.
Not a question, it's an answer.
I like that. So
Yeah.
in response to ham radio, it and other amateur stations appeared in Edmonton around 1914, and CJCA started in 1920. Thank you so much for adding that.
Thanks, Kalila.
All right. And I have other people that I need to say thank you to, and that is all of our e-campers. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your Thursday evening with Tom and I and everybody else as we explore Edmonton's identities and how they connect to our city and to the stories of this place. Thank you so much for being involved in ECAMP and coming out today. It really does mean a lot. All right, so we are going to say goodbye for now, folks. I want to encourage you to check out our website. I very humbly ask that you complete the post-event evaluation survey that's going to be sent your way. It'll help us evaluate what we're doing and move forward with the program. And once again, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us. And it's always a pleasure to learn from you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a good night, folks, and we'll see you later.